Have you ever heard of Zipporah, the wife of Moses? If you're like most people, you probably know a lot about Moses, his encounter with the burning bush, the plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, but what about his wife? Why is so little said about her? And why does the Bible contain one of the most mysterious and shocking incidents involving her? Zipporah's story is one of mystery, faith, and a moment of divine intervention that almost cost Moses his life. Yet, despite being a crucial figure in one of the most famous biblical narratives, she is often overlooked. Who was she? Why did God almost kill Moses because of her? And how did she change the course of history? Moses is one of the most well-documented figures in the Bible. We know about his childhood in Pharaoh's palace, his flight to the desert, and his calling to lead the Israelites to freedom. But when it comes to Zipporah, details are scarce. Her name appears only a handful of times, yet in one of those moments, she does something so crucial that it saves Moses' life. Think about that. The man chosen by God to deliver his people was nearly struck down before even beginning his mission. And the one who intervened? Not an angel. Not a prophet. But his wife, Zipporah. The Bible doesn't give us a detailed biography of Zipporah. What we do know is that she was not an Israelite. She was a Midianite, the daughter of Jethro, a priest of Midian. Moses met her after fleeing Egypt, and their relationship would go on to shape the events of the Exodus in ways few realize. But what's even more intriguing is what happened on their journey back to Egypt. A cryptic passage in Exodus describes a terrifying moment where God himself sought to kill Moses. And in a shocking turn of events, it was Zipporah who took decisive action, performing an act that changed everything in an instant. To understand Zipporah, we need to go back in time, long before Moses, before the Exodus, before even the Israelites were a nation. Zipporah was not an Israelite, she was a Midianite, a descendant of Abraham through his lesser-known wife, Keturah. This connection is crucial because it places the Midianites as distant relatives of the Hebrews, yet with distinct cultural and religious practices. The Midianites were a nomadic people who lived in the region of Midian, located in present-day northwest Saudi Arabia and southern Jordan. They were traders, herders, and worshippers of God, though their religious beliefs were different from those of the Israelites. Midian had a complex relationship with Israel. At times, they were allies, at others, they were bitter enemies. For example, when Joseph was sold into slavery, it was the Midianites who took him to Egypt, Genesis 37 verse 28. Later, during the time of the Judges, the Midianites oppressed Israel, leading to Gideon's famous victory over them, Judges 6-8. Yet, despite these tensions, one Midianite family would play a pivotal role in biblical history, the family of Jethro, the father of Zipporah. Zipporah's father, Jethro, also called Reuel, was a priest of Midian. This means he was a religious leader, possibly leading the worship of El Shaddai, a name for God used by Abraham. While the Midianites were not Israelites, they retained knowledge of the God of Abraham, making Jethro a key figure in bridging the gap between Midianite and Hebrew faith. Jethro wasn't just a religious leader, he was also a wise counselor. Later in Moses' story, he would give crucial advice that helped shape the leadership structure of Israel, Exodus 18. But long before that, Jethro's influence was already significant. He was the man who gave Moses a home when he fled Egypt. Moses' story took a dramatic turn when he killed an Egyptian taskmaster who was beating a Hebrew slave, Exodus 2 verses 11-12. Forced to flee for his life, Moses ran into the wilderness, leaving behind the luxury of Pharaoh's palace. He arrived in Midian, thirsty, exhausted, and with no plan for the future. That's when he encountered Zipporah and her sisters. In Exodus 2 verses 16-22, we learn that Jethro had several daughters who came to a well daily to water their father's flock. But local shepherds would often harass them, driving them away. That day, however, Moses intervened, driving the bullies off and helping the women water their flocks. When they returned home, their father Jethro was shocked at how quickly they had finished their work. When they told him about the Egyptian man who had helped them, Jethro immediately invited Moses to dinner. It didn't take long for Jethro to recognize Moses' potential. He welcomed Moses into his household, and in a gesture of great honor, he gave him Zipporah as a wife, Exodus 2 verse 21. Their marriage was unusual for several reasons. Moses was a fugitive, he had no wealth, no power, and no clear future. Yet, Jethro saw something in him. Zipporah was not an Israelite. Intermarriage with foreigners was often frowned upon in Hebrew tradition, yet here was Moses, God's future prophet, marrying outside his people. Their backgrounds were vastly different. Moses was raised in the grandeur of Pharaoh's palace, while Zipporah was a Midianite shepherdess. Yet, despite these differences, their union would become a crucial part of Moses' journey. Life as Moses' wife would not have been easy for Zipporah. She married a man with a troubled past, a man who, at the time, had no clear future. But more than that, she was stepping into a completely different cultural and religious world. The Midianite culture was semi-nomadic, focused on family, honor, and religious devotion. Midianite women had more freedom and influence compared to Israelite women, particularly in spiritual matters. This may explain why Zipporah took action later in Exodus when Moses hesitated. She was used to making bold decisions. Meanwhile, Hebrew culture was more rigid, especially regarding religious rituals like circumcision. Zipporah likely knew about circumcision but didn't grow up practicing it. This difference in tradition would later lead to one of the most shocking and mysterious moments in the Bible, a moment where Zipporah had to step in to save Moses' life. After marrying Zipporah, Moses settled into a quiet life as a shepherd. They had a son, Gershom, whose name means, a foreigner there, Exodus 2 verse 22. This name reveals Moses' inner conflict. He was neither fully Egyptian nor fully Midianite, and he no longer had a home among the Israelites. For 40 years, Moses lived in exile, building a life with Zipporah, working for Jethro, and raising his family. It seemed as though he had left his past behind for good. But everything changed when he encountered a burning bush. One day, while tending Jethro's sheep, Moses saw a bush that was on fire but not consumed. From within the flames, God spoke, calling Moses to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites to freedom, Exodus 3 verses 1 to 12. This divine calling wasn't just a challenge for Moses, it was a turning point for Zipporah as well. Her husband was about to embark on a dangerous mission. Would she go with him? At first, Zipporah accompanied Moses on his journey back to Egypt. But what happened next was completely unexpected. In one of the most cryptic passages in the Bible, God suddenly sought to kill Moses, Exodus 4 verses 24 to 26. And in a moment of desperation, Zipporah took action in a way that no one saw coming. Few passages in the Bible are as cryptic and unsettling as Exodus 4 verses 24 to 26. After receiving his divine mission at the burning bush, Moses was on his way back to Egypt with Zipporah and their sons when something shocking happened. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," she said. So the Lord let him alone. Exodus 4 verses 24 to 26, NIV. What just happened? Why would God, after calling Moses to lead Israel, suddenly try to kill him? And why did circumcision, a Hebrew ritual, become the turning point in this bizarre encounter? To understand this event, we need to break it down carefully. Moses had just received one of the most important assignments in biblical history, to free the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. He was traveling with Zipporah and their sons, heading back to Egypt, when the text abruptly states that God sought to kill him. The Bible doesn't specify how God threatened Moses. Was it an illness? A supernatural attack? A sudden paralysis? We don't know. But what's clear is that this was a life-threatening moment, and Zipporah acted swiftly to save her husband. Why was God angry? There are several theories as to why God reacted this way, but the most widely accepted explanation is this: Moses had failed to circumcise his son. Circumcision was a sacred covenant between God and Abraham's descendants, Genesis 17 verses 10 to 14. Every Hebrew male was to be circumcised on the 8th day after birth, marking him as part of God's chosen people. Failure to do so meant breaking the covenant. Moses, chosen as the leader of Israel, was about to confront Pharaoh as God's representative, but he had neglected this fundamental sign of obedience. If he couldn't uphold God's covenant in his own household, how could he lead an entire nation in following God's commands? Seeing her husband on the brink of death, Zipporah didn't hesitate. She took a flint knife and circumcised their son herself, an act that was usually performed by fathers or priests. Her words, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," suggest that she found the ritual disturbing, yet she did it anyway. This implies she may have opposed circumcision before. As a Midianite, Zipporah likely wasn't raised with this practice. Her reluctance might explain why their son had remained uncircumcised in the first place. She understood the urgency. Despite her possible discomfort, she recognized that Moses' life depended on fulfilling this covenant. She saved Moses when he hesitated. Moses, the man who would stand before Pharaoh, had been passive in this moment. It was Zipporah who acted, proving her strength and decisiveness. The fact that God immediately let Moses alone after the circumcision shows just how serious this issue was. The blood shed in the act was a symbolic atonement, securing Moses' survival and reaffirming his place under God's covenant. This event is a foreshadowing of future biblical themes. The importance of obedience to God's covenant. Just as Moses had to circumcise his son, the Israelites would later be required to obey God's laws to enter the Promised Land. Blood as a means of salvation. In the same way that circumcision spared Moses, the Passover blood would later save the Israelites from the final plague in Egypt. The role of an intercessor. Just as Zipporah stepped in to save Moses, Jesus would later become the ultimate intercessor, offering his blood for humanity. This story reveals several key aspects of Zipporah's character. She was decisive and courageous. When Moses hesitated, she acted. She was protective of her family. Despite being an outsider to Hebrew traditions, she did what was necessary to save her husband. She had influence over Moses. Her words, "bridegroom of blood," suggest that she challenged him on this issue, highlighting the tension between their cultural backgrounds. Interestingly, after this event, Zipporah seems to disappear from the journey. In Exodus 18, we find that she and their sons are sent back to her father, Jethro, while Moses continues leading Israel out of Egypt. Some scholars believe that this moment created a rift between Moses and Zipporah, that she may have resented his divine calling and preferred to return to Midian. Others suggest that Moses sent her away for safety, knowing the dangers ahead in Egypt. Regardless of the reason, Zipporah's absence during the Exodus highlights the cost of Moses' mission. He would lead a nation but be separated from his own family. Zipporah's role in the Bible is brief but incredibly significant. She was more than just Moses' wife, she was a woman who protected her husband when even he hesitated, upheld God's covenant even when it went against her own customs, influenced the destiny of Israel through her actions. Her story reminds us that sometimes, the unexpected heroes are the ones who act in moments of crisis. Without Zipporah's quick thinking, Moses' mission might have ended before it even began. The last time we saw Zipporah, she had just saved Moses by circumcising their son on the way to Egypt. But after that, she disappears from the biblical narrative. As the events of the Exodus unfold, from the plagues to the parting of the Red Sea, Zipporah is not mentioned alongside Moses. This raises an intriguing question. Backhand index pointing right, what happened to Zipporah after that mysterious encounter? The answer appears later in Exodus 18. After crossing the Red Sea and journeying through the wilderness, Moses and the Israelites camped near Mount Sinai. It was then that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law and priest of Midian, arrived bringing Zipporah and their two sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Open book. Now Jethro, the priest of Midian and father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. Exodus 18 verses 1-2. Here, the text reveals an important detail: Moses had sent Zipporah back. But when did this happen? Most likely, soon after the strange encounter on the way to Egypt, before the plagues began. It may have been a strategic decision by Moses to protect his wife and children from the dangers ahead. Now, after the liberation of Israel, Jethro brings Zipporah back to Moses, leading to an emotional reunion. Imagine the scene: Moses had spent months facing Pharaoh, witnessing miracles, leading an entire nation through the desert, and now he was reunited with his family. How did he feel seeing Zipporah again? And Zipporah? Did she feel resentment for being left behind? Did Moses' sons even recognize him after so much time apart? The Bible does not describe these emotional details, but we can assume that this was a moment filled with both tension and relief. Moses had fulfilled his mission, but at what cost to his family? The reunion of Moses with Zipporah and their children was significant, but this chapter introduces another interesting twist. Jethro, in addition to bringing Zipporah back, observes how Moses was leading Israel and notices something concerning. Open book. The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. Exodus 18 verse 13. Moses was overworking himself, trying to solve all of the people's disputes on his own. Then Jethro gives him crucial advice. Open book. Select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Let them serve as judges for the people at all times, but bring the difficult cases to you, the simple ones they can decide themselves. Exodus 18 verses 21-22. This is a key moment. Moses learns to delegate responsibilities, something essential to leading the nation without exhausting himself. As Moses' wife, Zipporah likely felt the effects of this as well. If Moses was always busy solving the people's problems, did he have any time for his family? The Bible does not mention Zipporah after this reunion. This leads to a few possibilities. Keycap 1. She remained with Moses for the rest of the journey through the desert. Keycap 2. She returned to Midian with Jethro and their children, living far from Moses. If Zipporah had stayed with Moses, it would be expected that the biblical text would mention her again. The silence regarding her presence may indicate that she returned to Midian, leaving Moses focused on leading Israel. If this was the case, we can imagine the emotional sacrifice involved in that decision. Zipporah loved Moses, but did she feel that there was no longer room for her alongside the man who was now leading an entire nation? Zipporah may not be a central figure in the Bible, but her influence was crucial. White heavy checkmark. She saved Moses from death, ensuring that he could fulfill his calling. White heavy checkmark. She made a great sacrifice, staying away from Moses for her own safety and that of their children. White heavy checkmark. She returned at the right moment, reuniting their family and allowing Moses to learn a crucial leadership lesson from Jethro. Even though she disappears from the narrative after this reunion, her impact on Israel's history remained. Without Zipporah, Moses might never have made it to Egypt. Without Zipporah, he could have died that night in the desert. Without Zipporah, the story of Israel's liberation might have been very different. And that's the lesson we take from her story. Sometimes, the secondary characters make all the difference. After Zipporah's reunion with Moses in Exodus 18, the narrative goes quiet about her role. From this point on, she vanishes from the biblical story. But why? What happened to Zipporah, and why does the Bible leave so many questions unanswered about her fate? In this chapter, we will explore the mystery surrounding Zipporah's disappearance, analyze what the Bible does, and doesn't, say, and consider possible theological interpretations. After the moment of reunion in Exodus 18, Zipporah and her children are never mentioned again in the Exodus narrative. Moses continues to lead Israel through the wilderness, receiving laws, facing battles, and dealing with the challenges of guiding a rebellious people. But Zipporah's absence is striking, especially after her crucial role in saving Moses' life. The silence raises an important question. Backhand index pointing right. Why does the Bible not mention Zipporah during the rest of Israel's journey in the desert? Could it be that Moses and Zipporah's separation was permanent, or is there something deeper at play here? Let's consider a few possibilities. One of the most plausible explanations is that Zipporah returned to Midian after their brief reunion. After all, her father, Jethro, is a priest of Midian, and it could have been wise for her and her children to stay with him, away from the dangers of the wilderness. Moses, at this point, is deeply involved in leading the Israelites and is likely preoccupied with the monumental task of establishing the nation. Zipporah, a Midianite woman, may have felt out of place in the midst of such a large-scale operation. She could have returned home to be with her father and to live a safer, quieter life. This interpretation would explain her disappearance from the narrative. The Bible is primarily focused on the journey of Israel, and Zipporah may not have been part of that anymore. Another possible reason for Zipporah's disappearance is the tension that may have existed between Moses and Zipporah. After all, their relationship was one filled with complexities and cultural differences. Consider the episode in Exodus 4 verses 24 to 26, where Zipporah's quick thinking saves Moses' life by circumcising their son. Some scholars argue that this was a moment of great tension in their relationship. Moses had failed to perform the act of circumcision on his son, an essential covenantal rite for the Israelites, and Zipporah, acting in desperation, took it upon herself. This act could suggest a disconnect between Moses and Zipporah in their understanding of God's commands. If Moses and Zipporah had theological differences about God's law, especially about the covenant of circumcision, it's possible that this disagreement might have led to a strained relationship, pushing Zipporah further into the background of the story. It's also worth noting that Moses' role as a leader of Israel and his growing responsibilities could have created significant emotional and physical distance between them, contributing to Zipporah's absence from later parts of the story. Perhaps Zipporah's role was meant to be silent and supportive, standing in the background of Moses' leadership. In this interpretation, her absence is not a sign of her departure, but rather her silent presence in Moses' life and work. Moses was the leader of Israel, and his journey was centered around God's calling and the fulfillment of prophecy. Zipporah may not have played a public role after the Exodus because her presence was not necessary to the unfolding of Moses' divine mission. Her actions up to that point, circumcising her son, supporting Moses during his time of exile, were key to ensuring that Moses could accomplish his purpose. After these significant moments, Zipporah may have quietly stepped into the background, allowing Moses to lead without distraction. Her role was not to be in the spotlight, but to support the larger narrative of God's work through Moses. This interpretation calls attention to the importance of silent support, a reminder that not all roles in God's plan are public or visible, but they are still crucial. In addition to these theological interpretations, there is another layer of meaning in Zipporah's disappearance. Her absence might symbolize the silent, often overlooked figures in God's plan, those who play essential roles but whose stories are not always told in full. The Bible frequently features secondary characters, figures who do not appear as central figures in the narrative, but whose actions have a lasting impact on God's work. Zipporah's role as Moses' wife, her pivotal actions in saving Moses, and her absence later in the story can serve as a reminder that not everyone who plays a key role in God's purposes will be seen or remembered in the public eye. In this way, Zipporah becomes a symbol of quiet obedience and faith. Her actions may not have been celebrated by the people, but they were essential to the unfolding of God's plans for Israel. Zipporah's disappearance also invites us to reflect on the role of women in the Bible more broadly. Many women in the scriptures are not given the attention they deserve, and their contributions are often overlooked in favor of male-centered narratives. Zipporah is just one example of a woman whose actions made a significant impact on the trajectory of Israel's history, but who fades into the background as the story progresses. This is a reflection of a larger biblical theme, the quiet, often invisible power of women. In her story, Zipporah shows us that faithful service, even when not seen by the public eye, is valued in God's kingdom. Zipporah's mysterious disappearance after Exodus 18 invites us to reflect on several key lessons. Keycap 1. Faithfulness in the background. Just because someone's story isn't in the spotlight doesn't mean their role isn't crucial. Like Zipporah, many people serve faithfully behind the scenes, making things happen for God's plan. Keycap 2. Supporting the mission. Zipporah's actions, whether as a wife, a mother, or a supporter, were vital to Moses' mission. Sometimes, our role may be to support someone else's journey and help them succeed. Keycap 3. God uses ordinary people. Zipporah wasn't a prophet or a leader in the traditional sense, but God used her in profound ways. This reminds us that God's plan doesn't always depend on those we expect. Zipporah's absence does not diminish her importance. It highlights the profound truth that the quiet, hidden moments can be just as valuable as the public ones. Zipporah's story stands out for its complexity and mystery, but how does she compare to other women in the Bible who played pivotal roles in God's plan? Throughout Scripture, we see a variety of women, some famous and others lesser known, whose faith, courage, and actions have left lasting marks on biblical history. Let's take a closer look at how Zipporah compares to some of these women. Deborah, a judge and prophetess. Deborah is one of the most well-known women in the Bible. She served as a judge and prophetess during a time when Israel was in desperate need of leadership. In the book of Judges, we see Deborah leading the Israelites in a military victory over the Canaanites. Her role was prominent and highly visible, as she was called by God to lead and to speak His word. While Zipporah's role was less public, both women had an essential part in shaping the destiny of Israel. Deborah's leadership and Zipporah's quiet support highlight the different ways women contribute to God's kingdom. Deborah led with authority, while Zipporah's contributions were more supportive but no less crucial. The key difference between Zipporah and Deborah is visibility. Deborah's role was public, while Zipporah's was more behind the scenes, emphasizing that God can use women in diverse ways, whether publicly or quietly. Jael, a woman of courage. Jael, another woman from the book of Judges, demonstrated incredible courage when she killed Sisera, the commander of the enemy army, in a surprising act of bravery. Jael's act of heroism was pivotal in the victory of Israel, and her story is often highlighted as an example of courage and faith. Similar to Jael, Zipporah acted decisively in a moment of crisis, when she circumcised her son to save Moses' life, Exodus 4 verses 24 to 26. Both women acted in pivotal moments to protect the leaders of Israel, though their actions occurred in different contexts. Jael's action was dramatic and public, while Zipporah's was quieter, yet equally significant in ensuring Moses could fulfill his divine calling. What sets Zipporah apart, however, is that her act of courage was driven by necessity. There was no battle or visible enemy, rather, it was her faithfulness to the covenant that played a role in saving Moses, who was on the brink of death. It demonstrates the importance of obedience and faithfulness, even in the face of obscurity. Sarah, the matriarch of Israel. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, is one of the most iconic women in the Bible. She is recognized as the mother of Isaac, through whom the promise of God to Abraham was fulfilled. Her story is deeply tied to faith, as she had to trust God for a child despite her old age. While Zipporah's role was not as foundational to Israel's lineage as Sarah's, her importance lies in her support of Moses' mission. Sarah's patience and trust in God's promises stand in stark contrast to Zipporah's more immediate and active intervention to safeguard her family. However, both women demonstrate that God's plan for His people can be advanced through the faithful obedience of women, whether in the long term like Sarah or in the critical, seemingly unnoticed moments like Zipporah. Sarah's role was often one of waiting and trusting in God's timing, whereas Zipporah's was one of immediate action in a life-or-death situation, showing that God uses women in different seasons of life to fulfill His plan. There are many women in the Bible whose roles are critical, yet their stories are often overlooked or less emphasized. Miriam, Moses' sister, played a role in the early life of Moses, watching over him when he was placed in the Nile and leading Israel in praise after the Red Sea crossing. Esther, though, had a more dramatic public role as the queen who saved the Jewish people from annihilation, but even her story began with quiet courage and obedience. Zipporah's story is in many ways similar to these women. Her role may not have been as visibly dramatic as Esther's or as essential to Israel's leadership as Miriam's, but her actions were quietly powerful. She represents the often overlooked women who played key, though uncelebrated, roles in God's work throughout history. In a sense, Zipporah reminds us that not all contributions to God's work are celebrated in the public eye. Women like Zipporah, Miriam, and Esther, though varying in their visibility, demonstrate that God uses all kinds of women, whether as quiet supporters, like Zipporah, or as public leaders, like Esther. Zipporah's story reminds us that the Bible is full of women whose contributions to God's kingdom are often understated but never insignificant. God uses women in different ways, some are leaders, some are warriors, and some, like Zipporah, are quiet supporters. Regardless of their roles, all women who follow God's calling have an important place in His divine plan. As we reflect on Zipporah's story, we should be inspired by the truth that God values the quiet faithfulness of those who support others and fulfill His will in their own unique ways. Whether through public acts of courage or behind-the-scenes acts of support, the faithfulness of women like Zipporah is part of the ongoing story of God's work in the world. The story of Zipporah, though often overlooked, holds deep lessons for us today. Her life and actions may seem distant in time, but the truths embedded in her story are timeless and can inspire our daily walk with God. So, what can we learn from Zipporah's experience? How can we apply her example to our lives as modern-day believers? Faith in uncertainty. One of the most striking aspects of Zipporah's story is her faith in uncertain moments. As the wife of Moses, she lived through challenging circumstances, marrying a man on the run, journeying with him into the wilderness, and facing danger when God sought to kill Moses. Yet, through it all, Zipporah's actions were motivated by faith. Obedience even when she didn't fully understand the situation. In our own lives, we may find ourselves in situations where the future is unclear, and the path forward isn't obvious. Zipporah's story teaches us that faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting God to lead us through uncertainty. So, the power of quiet obedience. Zipporah's role in the biblical narrative is quiet and understated, yet it is no less impactful. Often, we might feel that our contributions to God's work need to be grand or visible to matter. But Zipporah's life shows us that obedience in the small, hidden moments is just as valuable as faithful actions even. For many of us, our daily lives are filled with small decisions that don't seem to make a huge impact on the world, but they can make all the difference in God's kingdom. Zipporah's example calls us to faithfully follow God in the mundane, trusting that even in these small acts, we are part of His larger plan. The strength of women in God's plan. Zipporah. This is a reminder that women have always had an essential role in the unfolding of God's will. Reg. One of the most powerful lessons from Zipporah's life is how God uses unexpected people in unexpected ways. Zipporah wasn't an Israelite, yet she was chosen to play a critical role in Israel's journey. Her story reminds us that God often chooses people who don't fit the mold of what we might expect. Whether we feel unqualified, overlooked, or out of place, God's purposes are not limited by our background, gender, or circumstances. God's ways are often mysterious, and He doesn't always use the people we would expect. Zipporah's life challenges us to embrace God's unexpected purposes, trusting that He can use anyone, anywhere, at any time to accomplish His will. Finally, Zipporah teaches us the power of supporting others in their calling. She stood by Moses during his exile and played a crucial part in his mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Her willingness to act in obedience to God's call, no matter how difficult the circumstances, was a critical element of Moses' success. In our own relationships, whether in marriage, family, or community, we are often called to be support for one another. Sometimes, the most significant contribution we can make is not leading the charge, but standing beside someone else as they fulfill their calling. Zipporah's life reminds us that supporting those around us is an act of obedience to God, and it can have lasting, far-reaching effects. Zipporah may not be one of the most widely recognized figures in Scripture, but her story is rich with spiritual lessons. She embodies faith in uncertainty, the power of quiet obedience, and the strength of women in God's plan. Her life reminds us that God can use anyone, no matter their background or station in life, to fulfill His purposes. Whether we are called to lead, to support, or to act in seemingly small ways, we can trust that God is working through our obedience to bring His kingdom to fruition. As we reflect on Zipporah's story, we should ask ourselves, how can we be like her in our own journey of faith? Are we willing to step up in moments of uncertainty, to quietly obey God in the unseen moments, and to support those around us in their calling? Zipporah's life challenges us to embrace God's purposes for us, whatever they may be, and to walk forward with faith, courage, and trust. Zipporah's story is not just a footnote in the life of Moses, but a profound reminder that God's purpose can unfold through the most unexpected individuals. Her obedience, courage, and role in the divine plan challenge our understanding of faith and leadership. So, the next time you read the story of Moses, ask yourself, what lessons can we learn from the silent strength of those who stand beside us, unnoticed but crucial? If Zipporah's impact has surprised you as much as it did me, then hit that subscribe button and join our community of curious minds seeking deeper understanding. Share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and comment below. Let's discuss what truly shapes the great leaders in God's plan. Sometimes, the most profound impact comes from those whose stories are rarely told.